Welcome, everyone. As the slide said, this is the panel on the QAA subject benchmark statement. If you have no idea what that is and also no interest, then you still have a chance to get up, I guess. We have a very distinguished panel here, and these are all members of the group that put together the statement. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to say a little bit about the statement itself and a little bit about what's different this year. And then I have a starter for 10 for each of our panelists to start the discussion, but we're very much looking forward to questions and comments from the audience as well. So for me, until a few years ago, I had kind of a dim idea of what the QAA was. Quality Assurance Agency, okay, you know, what role does it play exactly? I knew there were subject benchmark statements, which kind of described maybe what each of the subjects were that were, you know, what was being taught and so on. When I was asked to chair this subject benchmark statement working group, I did a little more sort of research on this. And what I discovered was that the statement itself changed quite a lot over the last few years. So the first statements that I had access to very much about topics and concepts that needed to be in an economics undergraduate degree. But over the years, those have changed towards looking more at skills. So what are we equipping our students to be able to do? So it's not just a list of the topics. And to a certain extent, this statement is kind of a natural follow-on from this. So this description, by the way, that's the QR code for the statement. So if you haven't seen it yet, do scan that, go and have a look. And even after the panel, if you have feedback on any of that, that would be great. So what it says is the SBS has described the nature of study and benchmark academic standards. That just means what is a first class, what is a 2-1, and so on. And then the second bit is where sort of the statement has moved over the last few years. This is the generic description of all of the subject statements, so it's not just economics. So what are graduates expected to know, but then also do and understand? So the do is becoming more and more important. And in this particular year, the specification that we got as members of the working group was also kind of more leaning towards a values-based approach to what are we doing. So when we're equipping students with, you know, an economics degree, it's not just about the knowledge, the concepts, and so on, the skills. So employability had become a big thing over the last couple of statements, but also, you know, what are they equipping them to do about the world around them? So solving problems about the world around them and so on. So it was a slightly different approach. I'm going to do a quick sort of rundown on sort of the slides. Okay, sure. Thank you. So just a quick rundown on sort of what these statements are. These are produced by members of the sector. So if you go on that, if you scan the QR code, you'll also get a link to who the members of the panel were. And there's people in the crowd here also who are members there as well. And the idea is very much that this is published as a guide, and I'm going to ask Alvin in just a second to talk a little bit more about that specific role for people in the sector. Excited. So what are the kinds of things that are included in this one? So we start with why a degree in economics, so all the kinds of things that we study in economics and what economists do, kind of thing. Next slide. The main teaching and learning sort of approaches in economics. This, in a way, is literally what this conference is about and what the group, the Economics Network, and so on are about. So what we tried to attempt to do here with the guidance of the QAA people was to look at both the reflection of what the reality is, but also to capture some of the best practice. So even if it's not the modal approach in the sector, but there are examples of good practice where others might want to go, trying to capture that as well. Thinking very much in terms of who might be using this. So if you're setting up a new program, you're revising a program and so on. So it's not just sort of backward looking, it's kind of forward looking as well. What are others doing? Just so that you can consider sort of, is this something that I want to do, I can do within my institutional context and so on. And what we tried to do also is to capture kind of what was happening across the sector. So not just at particular types of universities, not just at English universities, and so on. So it's fairly general. There's a balance always, isn't there? You know, making it general so that it's applicable to more people, but then, you know, there is some content. Without specificity, it doesn't make any sense, right? Next. So this was something that I think was the area where there was more new stuff than in previous statements. We spent a lot of time discussing across all our institutions and getting input from other places. There was a widespread consultation on this as well. There is a question around how are students assessed? And then there's a question around how should students be assessed? And we tried to capture a little bit of both. So the R was based on sort of modal sort of reflections of what people do in economics, but then we tried to capture, okay, what other things are people doing? So typically the SPSs have a lifetime about 4 or 5 years. So what we were trying to do is to not immediately date it so that it was irrelevant in the coming year. We didn't quite know about AI then, but since then, you know, it's become very clear that taking that kind of somewhat forward-looking approach was useful. As you know, assessment has always been an issue in the sector, and many people, I think, not people in this room probably, but many people would be keen to just say, let's just do, you know, traditional exams, in-person, closed book, invigilate, all of that stuff, solves all problems. What we tried to do is to sort of get the message across that that's one way of assessing, and there are many other ways of assessing. And within your context, your degree, your students, whatever, you will need to figure out sort of what the optimal mix of assessment methods are. But to give people who are setting up a program or revising a program some ideas about what you can do if you wanted to. So if these are the kinds of skills that you want your students to learn and to assess, what are the different kinds of things you can do? Just the last one, please. Perfect. So I'm going to come back to this in just a minute, but I'm going to start with my first question for Alvin. So Alvin obviously is the director of the Economics Network, but he has been, unlike the rest of us, I think, involved in the SPSs before, both from that and from a sector-wide view that you probably have more than many other people here. What's the difference, the status of this statement, this year's statement, compared to previous years and also across the different developed nations?
Okay, thanks. I'm conscious. So there are people from abroad here, so who may not know the status of these statements. So I'll try and put it in a bit of context, and probably there are others in the room who may not know the detail of this. But up until the 28th of June, 2022, does it need to be? Oh, wow. I've learned a lot already. Yeah, so I was just saying there are people who may not know very much about the status of these. Up until these statements, up until the 28th of June last year in 2022, these statements, which were never regulatory, so they were never statements which told universities how they should design and deliver their degrees, but they had an important place in the regulation and funding of universities across the United Kingdom. And what that meant was that these statements were they were an important reference point because they represented sector-based standards, threshold standards, that universities needed to reference these statements in order to satisfy the regulatory authorities, the educational regulatory authorities, that they were fit for purpose in delivering the degrees. And the other thing I'll just say here is that this was all part of, these standards were all part of a European set of standards known as the European Standards and Guidance, which is part of a kind of European framework. And that framework requires that when universities are establishing and demonstrating their quality to the regulators, that they involve students, that the reports are transparently publicized, and there's a number of other sort of regulatory requirements. And Britain, all of the devolved nations were part of this. And I say 28th of June last year, because that was the point at which the Quality Assurance Agency, which owns and runs these subject benchmark statements, got thrown out essentially of the European sort of agreement because the quality procedures in England were no longer following those requirements that are outlined. So they were no longer routinely using students on guidance on quality assurance panels, nor were they routinely publicizing transparently all of the reports that they were producing. And this was a problem for the QAA, because obviously the QAA wants to be seen as part of this framework, and it gets a lot of money from that because that's how it sells itself, right? It works for regulatory authorities, ensuring that it helps institutions meet these kind of obligation standards. And the reason this happened was because the Office for Students, and this has been recorded, so I won't mention the thing I was going to mention about George Orwell, but the Office for Students was responsible for taking students out of that quality assurance framework, essentially. So this is a real problem for the QAA. And so the QAA asked the Office for Students to become de-designated. This is a word that I've only ever come across in the context of quality assurance. But so the QAA was de-designated. And what that means is they were the designated quality assurance body for the UK as a whole. But obviously all the devolved nations have their own educational regulation. And but because the Office for Students had, in a sense, violated or led the sort of England into a place where quality assurance no longer satisfied these European standards, the QAA, to defend itself, decided that it wanted to become de-designated. So as of March this year, the QAA is no longer the official designated quality body of England, but it remains important in the statutory regulation in Wales and in Scotland, and to a certain extent in Northern Ireland, which has a slightly different regulatory system. What that means is, in England, these statements they're no longer recognized as sector recognized standards of quality. So in England alone, not in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, these statements are purely advisory now. And so what that means for England is that institutions no longer need to reference them as they used to before. I need to be closer. Okay, apologies, Martin. Sounds very loud to me. That's the issue. So that's the issue. So that's the context of where we are with these statements. And what that means is, in England, if these statements are going to continue to be used by English universities, they are on a voluntary basis. And that is one of the reasons why I think there's been a slight shift in the status of these, in the way that these statements are being written. In the past, I think Parama touched on this briefly. In the past, they were really a kind of averaging of what was going on in the sector so that we could establish some kind of sector-based standard that all universities should reach. Now they have become, I would call it more forward-looking or aspirational. So there's a sense in these statements now, and certainly in the new one, I worked on the previous one as well, and it started to happen there, but it's certainly in this one, of a kind of desired direction in which the kind of group of us who, in consultation with the sector, think that economics should be heading. And that might be somewhat controversial, I think, in some quarters, but certainly I think there's a much more of a sort of should to the QAA statements, as opposed to just a description of what is happening out there. I'll stop there. I hope that provides some context about where we are with these statements. I just say one final thing, which is obviously there's a question here then, how will English universities continue to use these statements? We kind of have a good sense of how Welsh and Scottish and Northern Irish universities will. But what do they mean in England now, and how will we use them?
That's great. Thank you, Alvin. I should say, if there are questions on the answers at any point, it's probably a good idea to sort of ask them when you want, or at the end. It's fine as well. I think just to follow on from that, as I understand it right now, English universities do not have the equivalent. The idea is that the OFS itself will be the quality designated body, perhaps, but there's a bit of a void right now. And there are questions about the regulator also being the quality sort of assurer as such. So we don't.
Just to say, Parama, I mean, one consequence of this, of course, is that in Europe, the English universities, in a formal sense, no longer satisfy the kind of European standards and guidance. And that may have implications for joint degrees or sort of, provision that's done jointly with universities.
Yeah, so I guess watch this space, because we don't know exactly what will happen on that front. The point that Alvin made about these statements now being a bit more aspirational segues sort of perfectly into our next question, which is for Dimitra. So one of the things that the QAA asked all subjects to do this year was to look at these 3 or 4, I guess, considerations throughout their statement. So the idea is very much that in the context, so the first part of the statement talks about the context of the subject of the degree. How do these elements sort of come out? How are they embedded in what you do? So this was a big ask and quite a difference from what we had done before. So you can see already that, in a sense, what you choose to put into your statement as to how people are assessed and so on is up to the subject specialists in the working group. But these are topics that everyone has to address, and they've addressed them in slightly different ways. So Dimitra, question for you on these. So I've put the 4th one up as well, which is the requirements for the disabled students, but it connects to the first one as well. So obviously we have these areas of focus, and we've put in a lot of work. We had subgroups, and everyone here was a member of one of the subgroups to look at each of these areas to make sure that we were doing 2 things. So first, reflecting where the sector is, but then also trying to be a little bit aspirational about this is what the best practice, the good practice is, at least. So given this, how do you think this will impact how the statements are used by departments, especially in England, where it's now advisory, it's guidance and so on? So anything in terms of both the opportunities, because it's quite open in a way now, but also challenges in how departments use these.
Okay, okay, great. You can hear me, I think. Do I have to press the button? No, it's fine. All good. Great. So maybe I can begin by just highlighting the 3 different themes. Well, I would put the first 2 together. EDI and accessibility was one of the themes, which focuses very much around how to make both the content of what we deliver, but also the experience of students much more inclusive and diverse, so that taking into account the fact that, first of all, our student body is very diverse in terms of its origins, perhaps not as diverse as we would like it to be as well, because we know that certain groups are underrepresented in our discipline. And the emphasis is very much around both making creating a sort of lens through which to think about what we teach and how we assess students and what the student experience is, to bring a little bit more compassion around some of the themes and how they would be received by students. So, for example, I'm just trying to think of if you wanted to sort of, for example, teach about particular wage gaps. I think we talk about that in the statement, or statistical discrimination or something like this, thinking a little bit about your audience and about how some of our students might have experienced these things in their lives. So first of all, introducing some compassion, but also thinking a little bit about the relevance of what we're teaching to students from different backgrounds. So on the sustainability side, it's very much around thinking about sustainability and how it links to sort of the economics concepts we teach. I know that we teach so much that links to that, but sort of thinking about how that's all synthesized also in the minds of students, sort of so that they are equipped to sort of handle these things. And then the third one, which we were together on, which is the enterprise and entrepreneurship, that goes beyond employability. That was sort of very much thinking about placements, thinking about very much around the sort of self-determined student in the workplace, and about thinking about their role in society, about civic engagement, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to say, yes, it's advisory, but I think that in the practices of universities, the QAA is still there. So in sort of internal periodic reviews, it is still standard to say, well, discuss how your program relates to the sort of QAA subject benchmark statement. Are universities now going to take that bit out of their own internal procedures because it became advisory? I haven't seen it happen. In fact, the opposite. What I do participate on panels as an external member, and already I've seen EDI and sustainability emerge as themes that the university itself poses. So what I think is interesting is that the benchmark statement mirrors practice, at the same time, I think highlights areas of concern. So we know that universities are investing more and more in things around widening participation. So there's an element of that. But then at the same time, even though advisory, it does set an agenda, because once it's in the advisory statement, universities are asking departments, how does your delivery, how does your teaching link into sort of these themes, these objectives, these aspirations? I think what's interesting in terms of opportunities is that it invites us to embed the normative a little bit more into what we teach, recognizing that there are some value judgments, and trying to alert students to these a little bit more in a critical way, and inviting students to think about their role in the world, I think, and us to think about students. So I know that employability was very much the theme of the previous one, but I think this goes a step further. This is more about how do you contribute to sort of the way this world is going, sort of, civic engagement. We really hope we have there's a lot of aspiration in the document of the sort of students we want to produce and their role in society. So in terms of opportunities, I think it's clearly the document creates an opportunity for discussions and reflections in universities. But the challenges are, of course, that there are trade-offs, right? There are trade-offs in terms of resources and in terms of how we deliver things. If you're going to try and think about inclusivity, then let's think about it in the context of, say, assessment that you mentioned earlier. To be inclusive would mean more diversity of assessment, reflecting perhaps on the impact of different forms of assessment on different groups. The accessibility issue, there's a lot around neurodiversity, students of different backgrounds coming into university, but that creates work. It is the easy option to put them in an exam hall, but it's not necessarily the most interesting option. So I think it comes with opportunities, but a lot of costs and some workload issues. I mean, we're all coming out of the efforts of the pandemic. There's a lot of anxiety around AI and its impact on assessment. So it's really about, yes, these are very aspirational, but how do universities prioritize? How do they manage the trade-offs and the resource implications of adapting what you do to meet these aspirations? Yeah, great.
That's great, thanks. I have to say that the members of the working group and members of the subgroup put a lot of work into these themes. I mean, the first couple of ones might seem kind of obvious, but I think what the QAA was definitely pushing us to do was, it's not just about having a course, a module on inequality or on environmental economics. It should be embedded. So how is it embedded in the whole student experience? And that was, less easy than you might think about it at first, because there were a lot of, I can see some members in the audience here, there were a lot of robust conversations, I think, about how exactly, about, direction, about language also, because there was always this, I won't say conflict, but push and pull over being overly prescriptive, but also really saying these things are not all the same. There are things that we would recommend more than others. So really getting to that balance. Kind of linking onto that, one of the things that we tried to do with the statement is to ensure that all kinds of different universities could find this useful. One of the things that we didn't kind of directly address is where sort of economics is taught. So this is for economics in the sense, the assumption is that these are economics degrees. But I'm going to throw the question to Denise. So in addition to being Anglia Ruskin, which I said before, Denise is also the chair of the Royal Economic Society's Education and Training Committee. And in this role, we've worked together on the RES's diversity report. So looking at the pipeline for economics. And one of the things that I didn't know as much about, but I think, Denise, we've been having this conversation for a while, is that increasingly in everywhere other than the sort of academically most competitive universities in the UK, economics is taught in business schools, often as part of business degrees. And that makes it quite a different degree. It's a different audience, it's a different way of teaching. And I guess my question for you is, how do you think that that kind of development, that straight up econ degrees are increasingly taught in more and more elite universities and not elsewhere? So possibly the vast majority of people studying economics are not studying straight up economics degrees, which this statement has often aimed at. We've tried to not do that, be a little more inclusive. How do you think that develops, sort of how the statement is true? So how people in other kinds of departments would use the statement?
Thanks, Parama. That's almost the perfect question for me, so thank you. One of the things that I've learned actually in being at Anglia Ruskin and previously being at the University of Greenwich is that although in the post-92 sector this has happened quite quickly, now in many econ departments find themselves in the business school, and often finding themselves in the business school reluctantly, and trying to work out what that means for them, what that means for their degree, what that means for what they teach, and what that means for our discipline as a whole. And it can be framed in the negative and the positive, like anything in life. There's a deficit model and a positive environment. But one of the things that was really good about working on the benchmark statement, as you said, on the diversity report, was really thinking about this group of economists who find themselves in business schools. And what it means for us to do that. And one of the pieces of work that we'll do next year with as part of the committee at the Royal Economic Society is looking at that value of economics in business school to try and pitch the positives. So I'll rehearse a little bit of that in relation to teaching and learning and see what you think. The first is, one of the good things about having the framework is that obviously the business and management, one of these benchmarks, was also done at the same time. So they're following the same set of rules. There's still a requirement for the EDI to be included, for the entrepreneurship to be included, and so on. And one of the strengths of being an economist in a business school, once you've accepted your new reality, is that business schools are set up very much on that enterprise and entrepreneurship sense. And what I think we got in our subgroup was an opportunity to hear some of those from people who find themselves in business schools and see that there are actually opportunities that the business school offers, which might mean a little bit less work of our own to create it if we're willing to borrow. Of course, the limitation on that is many of us find ourselves in a scenario with a common first year. So one of the ways of managing student flows, as I've learned in my time as an interim PVC Dean, is if you have a common first year, you can manage the flow of students in and spread that burden across the disciplines quite neatly. And often economists find themselves with a service talk type module of basic economics. And that's not really covered in the business and management one, but this is probably not quite the economics we want either. So sort of thinking going forward, how do we find ourselves having a voice on the business and management benchmark statement, I think could be quite important. But the common first year means then that we're then trying to teach this curriculum, if we're still holding on to our unique business economics degree, in 2 years, not 3, having carried along a lot of other things with us that the business school determined to be important. So I think that these are conflicts that we've not got a resolution to, but hope with the Royal Economic Society benchmark statements Royal Economic Society looking at business economics in business schools, we might be able to get there. The last one to mention is I'll talk about business schools, but there is a whole world of other difference in the post-92 sector. And of course, a whole other part of a sector, which maybe some of you are from in the private providers, which I don't have any experience of myself either. And each of these environments is different in terms of how it relates to our roles as educators. So I know that from some of the work of members of the panel and colleagues in the room are looking at sort of economics teaching careers and what they look like. But for some of us, the teaching career is the dominant factor, and it's how we manage the research career. So Laura over there and I want to talk a little bit about how you maintain your research in that sort of teaching space. And then again, in the private provider, what does that look like when I work for Ardan and I've got 4 entry points a year and 12 weeks to onboard these students before I get the next lot? So there is a point for us to really consider our discipline, and it's some of the conversations that we've been having at RES, also with the econ network teams, thinking about the dominant characteristic of economics is no longer an economics department in a social science faculty, but the majority of us are often now in business schools or business and law faculties teaching with a common first year. And what does that mean for us going forward and for maybe the next lot of these benchmarks? So we had some good conversations. On a positive, I'd like to say that economics is something that can be taught well beyond our econ degrees. And some of the best teaching that I've ever experienced was teaching at the Institute of Education to teachers. And we can still start to think about that space maybe in the next iteration, to think about where else economics is taught and try to shift our default, because at the moment it's not quite designed where we think it is. Thank you.
I should say that the working group for this statement, we did have a call out, and to a certain extent we were successful in getting people from all those different areas of the sector that Denise talked about, just because there were, you know, many of us who had been in one particular sector would not know the realities of the other. And that picture is changing so much that it was very important to make sure that this was relevant for the next 5 years or so. I do have some questions of my own, but I'm going to open it up to questions or comments from the audience. And I think we have these cool throw mic things coming up. You have a question there already?
The audience, please speak into a couple of microphones. I don't know who.
Should we take, yeah.
You want me, okay, it might be quite a specific question. Well, there's a few economic historians in the audience, and the new benchmark statement has this new clause, which I quite like, about historical context of contemporary problems. And it mentions economic, it name checks economic history, and it sounds like music to my ears, incorporating economic history in other disciplines, in other subfields. But at the same time, in section 3.5, economic history is not mentioned as a field any longer, whereas in the last statement, it did mention economic history in a number of different places. So there's some progress, but also maybe not in this statement. From my discipline's perspective, I was just a bit, what's the thinking behind that?
So that's a very good question. I'm going to answer very briefly and then pass it on to my fellow panel members. I think we had, again, a robust discussion about this. I think there was a discussion about economic history and the historical context needing to be embedded throughout rather than being just another add-on course. And what you see in the language is, to a certain extent, a result of that. So it's at the beginning as something that you need to consider everywhere. And then, you know, the things that are not necessarily there are to a certain extent listed as fields. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. So something can obviously be a field and embedded everywhere.
Exactly.
So yeah,
high level could be a specialist thing you
absolutely.
capstone, but everywhere else it's embedded. My worry is that a head of department will say, oh, it's no longer a field, so we don't need to have that.
Do you want to?
Well, my answer would have been the same as Parama's, I think. I mean, I think we didn't want to name check everything that could be a kind of field of, of study as an optional or an elective unit later on. But I don't know if anyone has anything to add.
Just to say, I think the last benchmark statement did a really great job of actually sort of, here's economic history, take it seriously. I think that's where it was. So what we're trying to do is say that should be sort of a given in that sense, that we're building from that point. I take your point in terms of name checking, but the logic for many of the conversations that we were on with was, yes, that's important, which is a real game changer. Having been in a heterodox department twice now, that's a real game changer that the majority saw economic history as something that we just should have there, which was not the default, I don't think, 5 years ago or whenever the last statement was done. Again, Alvin would have been on those discussions. That would have been a big shift change, I think, in the last one. So I think it's an acceptance point, and therefore that's probably why it's not listed in that sense. It's an acceptance of the importance.
So this might be for Denise, but for everyone. So one of the things about economics being in business schools is that we get the joy of business school accreditation. And I was just wondering if there's any scope for this, because economics isn't very well covered in the accreditations, whether the QAA benchmark could become part of that, or that you can see it being some sort of lever for it to be used in a more effective way in that context.
I think that's a really interesting question, given that my new role is Deputy Dean for Accreditation. So that's quite interesting. I think where I'd conceptualise the value of economics is the fact that if you look at most of the ref returns, and I know this is not a ref space, but I am going to need to say it, in that sense, business schools that do well put their economists into their ref return. And that's very obvious. It's like a dummy variable shift. If you put it in, it's very obvious. So that's what's going on. And it means that we lament a lot that we don't have the funds coming through from our research in the same way, because it's not going through the ref there, but it's going through the ref here. I think that your point then is a similar thing on our teaching and learning. I think what we want to do with that statement for the Royal Economic Society, just taking a look at what's going on in business schools, economics in business schools, is to be able to give those sort of headlines. How do we make our discipline appear on the statements that are written for accreditation? Now, it is actually perfectly possible. Now, I've read the AACSB documentation and I have to draft this thing. I know the EQUIS one. Now I've had to read all these things. It's perfectly possible for us to be represented there as a discipline. And I'll take that away, Claudia. I think that you're right. There's no reason we can't use this, and the fact that they're linked, we've got the same baseline link to the two disciplines. What it's going to mean is us having a strong voice as economists in business schools, not be scared to say, you know what, we can give you something for the evidence base that we're inclusive from economics. We need to come forward with the examples, and we need to give those to the people who write those statements, because of course it's a production line. Once you get these badges, every so often you have to renew them, and it's a production line. But the voice is perfectly possible to be there. The structure of those accreditations has space for a narrative from econ. We're just not giving that narrative yet. And I will take that away and have a think about that in terms of Anglia Ruskin, if I can get the benchmark statements onto our AACSB. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
Oh, I want to throw the dice.
Give Claudia a chance to throw the mic.
Is this the best? Yeah, that's the best thing. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to shift towards being more aspirational if it's no longer binding in any way in England, but it's the same statement for universities in other parts of the UK. So I'd be interested to hear if it, my understanding is, yeah, it's a reference rather than like directly binding on universities. But that it sounds like you kind of raised the bar a bit because it's aspirational for England, but it's still kind of a reference point directly in a regulatory way for other nations of the UK. So I'd be keen to hear the thinking on that.
So yeah, I think part of the reason why we felt more comfortable moving it towards a more aspirational statement was, of course, that was the directive from the QAA. But also, I think even when it was a stronger ask in England, I'll be honest with you, there's, I mean, a lot of universities, mine included, I think, that didn't really pay attention to it in any case. So we had a lot of discussions about this, and there were a lot of people who said that this is an opportunity because our universities will take this seriously. So it is an opportunity to get this out there, given that even when it had a stronger role in England, people did feel free to almost ignore it. And so we really shouldn't sort of limit our ambitions by that kind of thing. And, you know, we had representatives from Wales and Scotland as well, obviously, who also felt comfortable enough that it wasn't pushing things so far that it would make them, that it make it difficult for them.
Just add something about this, because I think aspirational might not be the right word. I mean, it's aspirational in a particular sense. I mean, I mean, in economics, at least, certainly since the financial crash, the question about, you know, whether we're teaching the right stuff and what our social impact is, has become more important. So the kind of normative side and the question about, you know, what is it as what public duty do we have as economists, teachers, to our students and to the nation has become much more accepted than it was in the past. But then there are other aspects. So it's just, for example, the need to be more inclusive. That agenda has become across the sector, and in fact across business and across the world, much more important in recent years for good reasons. And sustainability, for obvious reasons, has risen up the agenda. So it's not a question of a group of us thinking this is what economics should be like. It's the question is, given those agendas, how can we make sure that economics is fit for purpose to deliver on the sustainability agenda and the inclusivity agenda and so on, and entrepreneurship? So that's the sense in which there's a directional kind of push, I think, now, but it's not quite a sort of a pure subjective wish that this is the way we would like economics to be, if that kind of makes sense.
Thank you.
Other questions? You'll still get to ask it, even if you.
Thank you for taking my needs into account there. I just have a thought about, how do you think this impacts the discipline of economics in the UK compared to the discipline of economics elsewhere in the world? My reason for asking that is because although I think my institution takes this quite seriously, I'm not quite sure how it lands within my department. And I've, you know, been in meetings where things have been raised like, oh, I don't need to worry about EDI quite so much in my teaching because that's just a British problem, which is obviously something I don't agree with. But I just, you know, we get a lot of people coming in to teach economics in the UK from all over the world. Kind of, how do I get this to match up with their experience elsewhere, I guess, is my thought.
Great question. Oh.
Yeah, it's a great question, because that's the line manager's nightmare, really, is trying to get a group of economists to actually pull together in the same direction. I think the point of an inclusive space, the sense of belonging, is bigger than a statement. So I think when you're looking at that, it's how do those lived experiences of all colleagues, including those who may not perceive this to be the direction of travel, how do you enable that voice, that discussion in the team? And one of the things that we had in my previous institution at the University of Greenwich, we had this sort of practice-based discussion once a month. We did have one of those sessions on EDI, and sometimes it's just having the right safe spaces for the right lived experience conversations, and, you know, the usual things that mean that people can say some things that maybe we don't repeat when we leave the room. So, you know, how we all move together, starting with the point of how do we make an inclusive workplace which enables those conversations to be had. And I think that, you know, you can't do that with in my opinion, the benchmark again sets an aspirational direction. But what you're really needing from your leadership teams are safe spaces to have those discussions. And what's interesting is economists can do it because I've seen it in 2 institutions now. But, you know, we have to design the spaces for those conversations. It can't be something that's done to you, in my view.
Also, it's not like any particular course would have to tick all these boxes. It's more a holistic thing, looking at it from a program point of view or even beyond, sort of, you know, how does this particular department deliver these things? So I think there is a leadership dimension and sort of thinking that, you know, there could be a vacuum of leadership in some places, but it does come from sort of a more holistic view. And in some places it comes from the students. So for example, in my institution, our PhD students said, we want to form a committee that proofreads in a good sense, reviews all the slides on the undergraduate with a view to decolonization. And we said, great, because, you know, and they came up with recommendations. So sometimes it's sort of student-led in some places. So it could emerge, and there could be different dynamics at play, but I think it is a holistic thing rather. And it's true that, you know, we're very international, and sometimes, and many universities hire from, you know, the AA job market, so you're going to have very much people with US PhDs. Certainly in the US, I think one of the big differences is, of course, the lack of the idea that it's not so much a system of courses with prerequisites where one leads to the next. There's so much fluidity in what students select, right? So you could have 2 graduates with an economics degree who just covered very different content. You have less of that here. So there's more control over sort of what the degree as a whole. A graduate from this degree will have these skills or this knowledge, whereas I think in other parts of the world, that's less the case because it's sort of so free what electives you take. I mean, that's my impression. I don't know if that's right. Is that right? I think so. That's the impression I have, that people can just opt in and out of different things. So, yeah.
Just gonna add 2 sort of quick points on that. So first is, I guess you could view the statement as an opportunity. So if you're a line manager, head of department, director of education, you know, whatever it is, you can use the statement, even though it's not required to follow it, to have some conversation. So use it as, this is what the QAA statement says, let's see what we can do around it, rather than having a less sort of structured conversation. It's still going to be a difficult conversation. I don't think there's any doubt about it, and the leadership will still be required. And when there's, you know, that kind of void in leadership, or maybe misunderstandings about sort of what education is and, you know, what we're trying to do here, what the mission is, that's going to be tough. The program overview kind of thing is the obvious way to go around it. So we're not literally asking everyone, you know, in each and every module to do this, because then there's a chance of this becoming a box ticking exercise, obviously, right? I have one line about something or the other. So that's cool. But I feel like, again, maybe this is just, you know, particular institutional view, but even that kind of program overview is sometimes a challenge. Just that coordinating, you know, getting all of that together, looking at something, even though, like Dimitra says, it's much simpler in this country than the UK. You have a program, you're entering a program, you have a very structured program in most cases. Even that kind of overview, rather than this is my module, might be difficult. So don't think I have any answers, more questions and saying, I hear you. Other questions or comments? Might have chance for one last one. We're to stick to time.
You want this one or that one?
Okay, thanks a lot for the very insightful discussion. So this question is more to we'll talk about EDI, we'll talk about overview of the program. So you just mentioned, for example, you in LSE, you also kind of collaborate with the PhD students to overview the curriculum for a BSc program. My question is about, suppose, I assume that after you review your BSc curriculum, you indeed find there might be some issues of a lack of diversity, those issues. My question is more about how to move forward. For example, you realize for some specific modules, the reading list, for example, or the topic or the application or examples are strictly dominated by white, authors and the topic is always focused on the Western Europe or US, then how would you convince those module leaders to try to diversify the modules, for example? More about how to move forward. The first step is indeed, we realize there's some issues. I think more important is how to address the issues. Yeah. Do you have a recommendation based on your experience in LSE? Thank you.
Well, these reviews did happen with the consent of the people involved. So it was more like, I think there was an understanding that, so for example, there does need to be some support behind it. So for example, the head of department thinking this was a good idea, bringing it to a departmental meeting saying, we're going to do this review. This is great because it's a lot of work and someone else is going to do it for us. And then that would lead to recommendations. And then that led to discussions and maybe some compromises. Because then someone might say, yes, but these authors are there because these are the key papers. And I'm sorry if they're all white, but these are the key papers. And then you think, well, how can we broaden it out in different ways? So it requires conversation and discussion and buy-in. And yeah, there are some moments in the life of a program or in a department where there's momentum for that kind of change. And sometimes it's not. So, at LSE, there was a couple of decades of no momentum. And then we had a really big momentum and sort of redesigned our whole curriculum. So I don't think it's uniform. I think there comes a time when you decide to look at something and then there's some buy-in. Another thing is it can't just be imposed from above. I think it can't just be critical. There have to be positive recommendations. So we didn't say, don't come and tell us these courses are bad. Come and tell us what you would tweak and how, and come with a proposal for discussion. And that worked very well. Yeah, so it's not about throwing things out. It's about enhancing. Yeah, and sometimes little things can go a long way. So we're talking about very small changes, not throwing stuff out. Yeah.
Okay, just one thing to say, just reflecting back on the situation in England, where these are no longer sort of have the same kind of statutory sort of status as they did before. I mean, these statements were never intended to tell departments. They never had regulatory force. They were never intended to tell departments what to do. And I think one of the opportunities in England, as well as in the devolved nations, is that these should be, and all of us in the room, I think, can have a role in this, a starting point for discussion, because what they represent is what the sector in some sense is doing in values. And so, when conversations are being had about diversity in the curriculum, this is a useful kind of reference point to kind of say, well, look, this is important, and we should think about how we can move forward with this. And so I think making sure that we reference these statements as good practice and moving forward. But I completely agree with Dimitra about the fact that this is really about enhancing, not about taking things away from the curriculum.
That's great. Thank you very much. Can I just say to everyone, there's the QR there. If you haven't read it already, you have more things to say. We want to sort of keep this conversation going. That's the way to keep it as a live thing rather than a static statement that just reflects a point in time. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to our panelists. And I think it's lunch now.